Chapter 4. Alas, in vain historians pry and probe, the same wind blows, and in the same live robe, truth bends her head to fingers curved cupwise, and with a woman's smile and a child's care examines something she is holding there, concealed by her own shoulder from our eyes. A sonnet, apparently barring the way, but perhaps, on the contrary, providing a secret link which would explain everything, if holy man's mind could withstand that explanation. The soul sinks into a momentary dream, and now with the peculiar theatrical vividness of those risen from the dead, they come out to meet us. Father Gabriel, a long staff in his hand, wearing a silk garnet red chasuble, with an embroidered sash across his big stomach, and with him, already illuminated by the sun, an extremely attractive little boy, pink, awkward, delicate. They draw near. "Take off your hat, Nicolia." Hair with a russet glint, freckles on his little forehead, and in his eyes the angelic clarity characteristic of near-sighted children. Afterwards, in the quiet of their poor and distant parishes, priests with names derived from Cyprus, Paradise, and Golden Fleece recalled his bashful beauty with some surprise. The cherub, alas, proved to be pasted on tough gingerbread, which was too hard for Minnie to bite into. Having greeted us, Nicolia again donned his hat, a gray, downy top hat, and quietly withdraws, very sweet in his homemade little coat and nankeen breeches, while his father, a kindly cleric who dabbles in horticulture, entertains us with talk of Saratov cherries, plums, and pears. A whirl of torrid dust veils the picture. It is, as is invariably noted at the beginning of positively all literary biographies, the little boy was a glutton for books. He excelled in his studies. For his first writing exercise, he painstakingly reproduced "Obey your sovereign, honor him, and submit to his laws." And the compressed ball of his index finger thus remained ink-stained forever. Now the 30s are over, and the 40s have begun. At the age of 16, he had a sufficient grasp of languages to read Byron, Eugene Sue, and Goethe, being ashamed to the end of his days of his barbarous pronunciation, and already had a command of seminary Latin, owing to his father's being an educated man. Besides this, he took Polish with a certain Sokolovsky, while a local orange merchant taught him Persian and also tempted him with the use of tobacco. Upon entering the Saratov seminary, he showed himself there to be a meek pupil and was never once flogged. He was nicknamed the Little Tov, although in fact he was not averse to general fun and games. In the summer he played dibbs and took pleasure in bathing. Never did he learn to swim, however, nor to fashion sparrows out of clay, nor to make nets for catching tiddlers. The holes came out uneven and the threads got tangled. Fish are harder to catch than human souls, but even the souls later escaped through the rents. In winter, in the snowy darkness, a rowdy gang used to tear downhill in a huge horse-drawn flat sled, while roaring out dactylic hexameters, and the chief of police in its nightcap would pull aside his curtain and grin encouragingly, happy that the seminarist's frolics would frighten off any night burglars. He would have been a priest like his father, and would have reached very likely a high rank, but for the regrettable incident with Major Protopopov. This was a local landowner, a bon vivant, a wencher, a dog lover. It was his son that Father Gabriel too hastily recorded in the parish register as illegitimate. Meanwhile, it transpired that the wedding had been celebrated without fuss, true, but honorably, 40 days before the child's birth. Dismissed from his post as member of the consistory, Father Gabriel fell into such depression that his hair turned gray. "That's how they reward the labors of poor priests," repeated his wife wrathfully, and it was decided to give Nicolia a secular education. What later became of the young Protopopov? Did he find out one day that because of him was he seized with that sacred thrill, or tiring rapidly in the pleasures of ebullient youth, withdrawing? Incidentally, the landscape which not long before had with wondrous languor unfolded across the passage of the immortal Britchka, all at Russian Viatic lore, so untrammeled as to bring tears to the eyes, all the humbleness that gazes from the field, from a hillock, from between oblong clouds, that suppliant, expectant beauty which is ready to rush toward you at the slightest sigh and share your tears. In short, the landscape hemmed by Gogol passed unnoticed before the eyes of the 18-year-old Nikolai Gavrilovich, who with his mother was traveling in carriage drawn by their own horses from Saratov to St. Petersburg. The whole way he kept reading a book. It goes without saying that he preferred this war of words to the corn ears bowing in the dust. Here the author remarked that in some of the lines he had already composed there continued, without his knowledge, a fermentation of growth, a swelling of the pea, or more precisely at one or another point the further development of a given theme became manifest. The theme of the writing exercises, for example, already during his student days, Nikolai Gavrilovich was copying out for his own benefit. Feuerbach's "Man is what he eats." It comes out smoother in German, and even better with the help of the spelling now accepted in Russian. Человек est, to Joe est. We remark also in the theme of nearsightedness develops too, beginning with the fact that as a child he knew only those faces which he kissed and could only see 4 of the 7 stars of the Great Bear. His rarest copper spectacles dawned at the age of 20. A teacher's silver spectacles bought for 6 rubles so as to distinguish his students in the cadet school. The gold spectacles of a molder, a public opinion, put on in the days when the contemporary was penetrating to the most fabulous depths of the Russian countryside. Again, copper spectacles bought at a little trading post beyond Lake Baikal, where they also sold felt boots and vodka. Yearning for spectacles, and a letter to his sons from Yakutsk territory requesting lenses for such and such vision, with a line marking the distance at which he could make out writing. Here the theme of spectacles dims for a time. Let us follow another theme, that of angelic clarity. This is how it developed subsequently. Christ died for mankind because he loved mankind, which I also love, for which I also shall die. Be a second Savior, his best friend advises him, and how he glows, "O timid, O weak!" An almost Gogolian exclamation mark appears bleedingly in his student diary, but the Holy Ghost must be replaced by common sense. Is not poverty the mother of vice? Christ should first have shot everybody and crowned them with flowers, and only then have preached morality. Christ the second would begin by putting an end to material want, aided here by the machine which we have invented. And strange to say, but something came true. Yes, it was as if something came true. His biographers mark his thorny path with evangelical signposts. It is well known that the more leftist the Russian commentator, the greater his weakness for expressions like the Golgotha of the Revolution. Chernyshevsky's passions began when he reached Christ's age. Here the role of Judas was filled by Vasilovod Kostomarov, the role of Peter by the famous poet Nekrasov, who declined to visit the jailman. Corpulent Herzen, ensconced in London, called Chernyshevsky's pillory column the companion piece of the cross, and in a famous Nekrasov iambic there was more about the crucifixion, about the fact that Chernyshevsky had been sent to remind the earthly kings of Christ. Finally, when he was completely dead and they were washing his body, that thinness, that steepness of the ribs, that dark pallor of the skin, and those long toes vaguely reminded one of his intimates, of the removal of the cross by Rembrandt. Is it? But even this isn't the end of the theme. There is still the posthumous outrage, without which no holy life is complete. Thus the silver wreath with the inscription on its ribbon, "To the Apostle of Truth from the institutions of higher education of the city of Kharkov," was stolen 5 years later from the iron-worked chapel. Moreover, the cheerful sacrilegist broke the dark red glass and scratched his name and the date on the frame with a splinter of it, and then a third theme is ready to unfold, and to unfold quite fantastically if we don't keep an eye on it, the theme of traveling, which can lead to God knows what, to a tarantass of a gendarme in a sewer uniform, and even more, to Yakutsk sled, harnessed to half a dozen dogs. Goodness, what Vilyusik captain of the police is also called Protopopov, but for the time being all is very pacific. The comfortable traveling carriage rolls on. Nikolai's mother, Eugenia Igorovna, dozes with a handkerchief spread over her face, while her son reclines beside her reading a book. And a hole in the road loses its meaning of hole, meaning becoming merely a typographical unevenness, a jump in the line, and now and again the words pass evenly by. The trees pass by, and their shadow passes over the pages, and here at last is St. Petersburg. He liked the blueness and transparency of the Neva. What an abundance of water in the capital, how pure that water was. He quickly ruined his stomach on it, but he particularly liked the orderly distribution of the water, the sensible canals, how nice when you can join this with that and that with this, and derive the idea of good from that conjunction. In the mornings he would open his window, and with a reverence still heightened by the general cultural side of the spectacle, would cross himself facing the shimmering glitter of the cupolas. St. Isaac's in the process of construction was all in scaffolding. We'll write a letter to father about the fired gold leaf of the domes, and one to grandmother about the locomotive. Yes, he had actually seen a train to which poor Belinsky, our hero's predecessor, had so recently looked forward when, with wasted lungs ghastly shivering, he had been wont to contemplate for hours through tears of civic joy the construction of the first railway station, that same station again on whose platform a few years later the half-demented Viscera of our hero's successor, wearing a black mask and green gloves, was to slash a handsome rival over the face with a riding crop. In my work, said the author, ideas and themes continue to grow without my knowledge or consent, some of them fairly crookedly, and I know it is wrong. The machine is getting in the way. I must fish this awkward spillikin out of an already composed sentence. A great relief. The subject is perpetual motion. The pottering with perpetual motion lasted about 5 years, until 1853, when already a school teacher and a betrothed man, he burned the letter with diagrams that he had once prepared when he feared he would die from that fashionable disease, aneurysm, before endowing the world with the blessing of eternal and extremely cheap motion. And the descriptions of his absurd experiments and his commentaries on them, in this mixture of ignorance and ratiocination, one can already detect the barely perceptible but fatal flaw which gave his latter utterances something like a hint of quackery, an imaginary hint, for we must keep in mind that the man was as straight and firm as the trunk of an oak, the most honest of the honest, his wife's expression, but such was the fate of Shereshevsky that everything turned against him. No matter what subject he touched, there would come to light, insidiously, with the most taunting inevitability, something that was completely opposed to his conception of it. He, for instance, was for synthesis, for the force of attraction, for the living link. Reading a novel, he would kiss the page where the author appealed to the reader. And what was the answer he got? Disintegration, solitude, estrangement. He preached soundness and common sense in everything, as if in response to someone's mocking summons. His destiny was cluttered with blockheads, crackbrains, and madmen. For everything he was returned a negative hundredfold. In Stranolyubsky's happy phrase, for everything was back-kicked by his own dialectic. For everything the gods had their revenge on him, for his sober views on the unreal robes of the poets, roses of poets, for doing good by means of novel writing, for his belief in knowledge. And what unexpected, what cunning forms of revenge assumed. What if he muses in 1848, one attached a pencil to a mercury thermometer, so that it moved according to the changes in temperature, starting with the premise that temperature is something eternal. But excuse me, who is this? Who is this making laborious notes in cipher of this laborious speculations? A young inventor, no doubt, with an infallible eye, with an innate ability to fasten, to attach, to solder inert parts together, having them give birth and result to the miracle of movement. And lo, a loom is already humming, or an engine with its tall smokestack and a top-hatted driver is overtaking a thoroughbred trotter. Right here is the chink which the nidus of revenge, since this sensible young man, who, let us not forget, is only concerned with the good of all mankind, has eyes like a mole, while his blind white hands move on a different plane from his faulty but obstinate and muscular mind. Everything that he touches falls to pieces. It is sad to read in his diary about the appliances of which he tries to make use. Scale arms, bobs, corks, basins, and nothing revolves, or if it does, then according to unwelcome laws in the reverse direction to what he wants, an eternal motor going in reverse. Why, this is an absolute nightmare. The abstraction to end all abstractions, infinity with a minus sign, plus a broken jug into the bargain. We consciously have flown ahead. Let us return to that jog-trot, to that rhythm of Nikolai's life, to which our ear had already become attuned. He chose the philological faculty. His mother went to pay her respects to the professors in order to cajole them. Her voice would acquire flattening overtones, and gradually she would begin to wax tearful and blow her nose. Out of all the St. Petersburg products, she was most struck by articles made of crystal. Finally, they, the respectful pronoun he used in speaking of his mother, that wonderful Russian plural, which, as later his own aesthetics attempts to express quality by quantity, returned to Saratov. For the road she bought herself an enormous turnip, At first Nikolai Gavrilovich went to live with a friend, but subsequently he shared an apartment with a cousin and her husband. The plans of apartments, as of all his other abodes, were drawn by him in his letters. The exact definition of the relations between objects always fascinated him, and therefore he loved plans, columns of figures, and visual representations of things, the more so since his agonizingly circumstantial style could in no way compensate for art of literary portrayal, which for him was unattainable. His letters to his relatives are the letters of a model youth. Instead of imagination, he was prompted by his obliging good nature, as to what another would relish. The Reverend liked all sorts of events, humorous or horrible incidents, and his son carefully fed him with them over a period of several years. We find mentioned therein Isler's entertainments, his replicas of Carlsbad, Minarashki miniature spas, at which venturesome St. Petersburg ladies used to ascend in captive balloons, the tragic case of the rowboat overturned by the steamer on the Neva, one of the victims being a colonel with a large family, the arsenic intended for mice which got into some flour and poisoned over 100 people, and of course the course of a new fad, table turning, all gullibility and fraud in the opinion of both correspondents. Just as in the somber Siberian years, one of his principal epistolary chords was the assurance addressed to his wife and children, always on the same high but not quite correct note, that he had plenty of money. Please don't send money. So in his youth he begs his parents not to worry about him and contrives to live on 20 rubles a month. Of this, about 2.5 rubles went on white bread and on pastries. He could not bear tea alone, just as he could not bear reading alone, i.e. he invariably used to choose something with a book. Over gingerbread biscuits he read the Pickwick Papers, over his Zwieback's the Journal des Débats. While candles and pens, boot polish, and soap came to a ruble, he was, let us note, unclean in his habits, untidy, and at the same time had matured grossly. Added to this a bad diet, perpetual colic, plus an uneven struggle with the desires of the flesh, ending in a secret compromise, and the result was that he looked sickly. His eyes had dimmed, and his youthful beauty nothing remained except perhaps the expression of a kind of wonderful helplessness, which beautifully lit up his face when a man he respected had treated him well. He was kind to me. A youth timorous and submissive, he later wrote of a scholar, Irenarch Vedinsky, a pathetic Latin intonation, animula vagula blandula. He himself never doubted his unattractiveness, accepting the thought of it, but fighting shy of its mirrors. Even so, in preparing to make a visit sometimes, especially to his best friends, the Lobodovskys, or wishing to ascertain the cause of a rude stare, he would peer gloomily at his reflection, would see the russety fuzz which looked as if to stuck on his cheeks, count the ripe pimples, and then begin to squeeze them, and at that so brutally that afterwards he did not dare show himself. The Lobodovskys. His friend's wedding had produced on our 20-year-old hero one of the extraordinary impressions which in the middle of the night cause a youth to sit down in nothing but his underwear to write in his diary. This exciting wedding was celebrated on May 19, 1848. That same day, 16 years later, Chernyshevsky's civil execution was carried out. A coincidence of anniversaries, a card index of dates. That is how fate sorts them in anticipation of the researcher's needs. A laudable economy of effort. He felt joyful at this wedding. What is more, he derived a secondary joy from his basic one. That means I am able to nourish a pure attachment to a woman. Yes, he was always doing his utmost to turn his heart so that one side was reflected in the glass of reason, or as his best biographer, Stranyolubsky, put it, he distilled his feelings in the alembics of logic, but who could have said that he was occupied at that moment with thoughts of love? Many years later, in his flowery sketches from life, this same Vasily Lobodovsky made a careless error when he said that his best man at the wedding, the student Krushtolen, looked as serious as if he were subjecting in his mind to an exhaustive analysis certain learned works from England that he had just read. French Romanticism gave us poetry of love, German Romanticism the poetry of friendship. The young Chernyshevsky's sentimentality was a concession to an epoch when friendship was magnanimous and moist. Chernyshevsky cried willingly and often. Three tears rolled down, he notes with characteristic accuracy in his diary, and the reader is tormented momentarily with the involuntary thought, how can one have an odd number of tears, or is it only the dual nature of the source which makes us demand an even number? Remind me not of foolish tears that many times I shed, alas, when my repose oppressive was, writes Nikolai Gavrilovich in his diary, addressing his wretched youth, and to the sound of Nekrassov's plebeian rhymery, he really does shed a tear. At this spot in the manuscript there is a trace of a spilled tear, comments his son Mihail in the footnote. The trace of another tear, far hotter, bitterer, and more precious, has been preserved on his celebrated letter from the fortress, but Steklov's description of this second tear contains, according to Stranyolubsky, certain inaccuracies which will be discussed later, that in the days of his exile, and especially in the Vilyusk dungeon. But behold, the theme of tears is expanding beyond all reason. Let us return to its point of departure. Now, for example, a funeral is being conducted for a student. In the light blue coffin lies a waxen youth. Another student, Tartarinov, who looked after him when he was ill, but who had hardly known him before that, bids him farewell. He looks long at him, kisses him, and looks again, endlessly. The student Chernyshevsky, jotting this down, is himself faint with tenderness, and Stranyolubsky, commenting on these lines, suggests a parallel between them in the sorrowful fragment by Gogol, Nights at a Villa. But to tell the truth, young Chernyshevsky's dreams are in connection with love and friendship are not distinguished for their refinement, and the more he yields to them, the more clearly comes out their fault, their rationality. He was able to bend the silliest daydream into a logical horseshoe, musing in detail over the fact that Lobanovsky, who he sincerely admires, is developing tuberculosis, and that in consequence Nadezhda Yegorovna will remain a young widow, helpless and destitute. He pursues a particular aim. He needs a dummy image in order to justify his falling in love with her. So he substitutes for it the urge to assist a poor woman, or in other words, sets his love upon a utilitarian foundation, for otherwise the palpitations of a fond heart are not to be explained by the limited means of that rough-hewn materialism to whose blandishments he had already hopelessly succumbed. And then only yesterday, when Nadezhda Yegorovna was sitting without a shawl, and of course her missionary, a plain dress, was slit a little at the front, and one could see a certain part just below her neck, a turn of phrase bearing an unusual resemblance to the idiom of literary characters in Zoshenko's impersonations of Soviet-bred Philistine simpletons. He had asked himself with honest anxiety whether he would have looked at that part in the early days after his friend's wedding. And so gradually bearing his friend in his dreams, with a sigh, with an air of unwillingness, and as if submitting to a duty, he sees himself deciding to marry the young widow, a melancholy union, a chaste union, and all these dummy images are repeated even more fully in his diary, when he subsequently obtains the hand of Olga Sokotovna. The actual beauty of the poor woman was still in doubt, and this method which Chernyshevsky selected in order to verify her charms predetermined the whole of his later attitude to the concept of beauty. At first he established the best specimen of grace in Nadezhda Yegorovna. Chance provided him with a living picture in an idyllic vein, albeit somewhat cumbersome. Vasily Petrovich knelt on a chair facing its back. She approached and began to tilt the chair. She tilted it a little and then laid her little face against his chest. A candle stood on the tea-table, and the light fell well enough on her, i.e. half-light, because she was in her husband's shadow, but clear. Nikolai Gavrilovich looked closely, trying to find something that would not be quite right. He did not find any coarse features, but he still hesitated. What should one do next? He was constantly comparing her features with the features of other women, but the defectiveness of his eyesight prevented the accumulation of the live specimens essential to a comparison. Willy-nilly he was forced to have recourse to the beauty apprehended and registered by others, to a woman's portraits. Thus, from the very beginning, the concept of art became for him a myopic materialist, which in itself is an absurd combination, something subsidiary and applied, and he was now able by experimental means to test something which love had suggested to him, the superiority of Nadezhda Yegorovna's beauty. Her husband called her dearie and dolly. That is life to the beauty of all other female heads. That is art. Art! On the Nevsky Avenue, poetic pictures were exhibited in the windows of Junkers and Desarios. Having studied them thoroughly, he returned home and noted down his observations. Oh, what a miracle! The comparative method was always provided the necessary result. The Calabrian charmer's nose in the engraving was so-so. Particularly unsuccessful was the glabella, as well as the parts lying near the nose on both sides of its bridge. A week later, still uncertain whether the truth had been sufficiently tested, or else wishing to revel once again in the already familiar compliancy of the experiment, he went out more to the Nevsky to see if there were not some new beauty in a shop window. On her knees in a cave, Mary Magdalene was praying before a skull and a cross, and of course her face in the light of the lamp was very sweet, but how much better was Nadezhda Yegorovna's semi-illumined face. On a white terrace over the sea were two girls. A graceful blonde was sitting on a stone bench with a young man. They were kissing, while a graceful brunette kept a lookout, holding aside a crimson curtain, which separated the terrace from the remaining parts of the house, as we remark in our diary, for we always like to establish what relation a given detail bears to its speculative environment. Naturally, Nadezhda Yegorovna's little neck is far more pleasing, hence comes an important conclusion. Life is more pleasing, and therefore better, than painting. For what is painting, poetry, indeed all art, in its purest form? It is a crimson sun sinking into an azure sea. It is a picturesque folds in a dress. It is the rosy nuances which the shallow writer wastes on illuminating his glossy chapters. It is garlands of flowers, bays, ponds, fresnae. The further it goes, the cloudier it gets, the rubbishy idea grows. The luxury of feminine forms now implies luxury in the economic sense. The concept of fantasy appears to Nikolai Gavrilovich in the shape of transparent but ample-breasted, sylphide, corsetless, and practically naked, who, playing with a light veil, flies down to the poetically poeticizing poet. A couple of columns, a couple of trees, not quite cypresses and not quite poplars, some kind of urn that holds little attraction for Nikolai Gavrilovich, and the supporter of pure art is sure to apply. Contemptible fellow, idle fellow, and indeed, rather than all this trash, how could one not prefer an honest description of contemporary manners, civic indignation, heart-to-heart jingles? One can safely assume that during those minutes when he was glued to the shop windows, his disingenuous master's dissertation, the aesthetic relations of art to reality, was composed in its entirety. It's no wonder that he subsequently wrote it right down, straight from the shoulder in 3 nights. But it is more of a wonder how, even after a wait of 6 years, he nonetheless received a master's degree for it. There were languorous and dim evenings when he lay supine on his dreadful leathern couch, a thing of lumps and rents with an inexhaustible, just pool supply of horsehair, and my heart beat somehow wondrously from Michelet's first page, from Gusat's views, from thoughts of Nadezhda Yegorovna, and all this together, and then he would begin to sing off-key in an ululent voice. He sang the Song of Marguerite, simultaneously thinking of the Lobrovskys' relations with one another, and gently tears rolled from my eyes. Suddenly he would rise from his couch with the decision to see her immediately. It was, we imagine, an October evening. Clouds flew overhead, a sour stench came from the saddlers' and carriage-makers' workshops on the ground floors of houses painted a dreary yellow, and merchants in smocks and sheepskin coats, keys in hand, were already locking up their stores. One bumped into him, but he passed quickly by. A ragged lamplighter, his hand-cart rumbling over the cobbles, was bringing lamp oil to a bleary lamp on a wooden post. He wiped the glass with an oily rag and moved on creakily to the next, a long way off. It was beginning to drizzle.